Okay, we're going to continue and finish up hopefully with Genesis chapter 16 this evening, and then if we do get into chapter 17, that's fine too. But I'm not anticipating it, but that's fine. So we have discussed, I think, at some length and with some difficulty, some of the ramifications of Sarai's plan with her maid Hagar and Abram to resolve their barrenness by a surrogacy. And we saw that it didn't really work out real well on a personal level, at least not for Hagar. So she has, at the end of verse 6, Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. So now let's read, just go ahead and read through verse 14 and see what went on there. We're in Genesis chapter 16. Our reading will be 7 through 14. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. He said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants, so that they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all of his brothers. Then she called the name of the Lord. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram. We'll finish that in a minute. Okay. Verses 7 through 14. Okay. What do we think about those verses? Sherry is saying good evening to everyone.
It's interesting that evidently God was watching over the whole process. And certainly he sent an angel to basically give Hagar some help. Or, I don't know how else to say that. They gave her some strength, help, and tell her what she needed to do. Plus, he gave her a promise of a descendant being an animal. Although a little bit rowdy,
Okay, so she receives comfort
it had to be comforting to her.
And guidance. Like you said, he told her what to do. He gave her really a path forward from where she was at, and maybe a path she couldn't have imagined before, having fled. If you're a slave and you flee your master, how welcome do you think you're going to be if you return? It depends. Yeah. So maybe she feared returning. She didn't like the treatment she was receiving, but she feared returning. She's told to do that. And then the prophecy received is a very gracious one to her. She's going to be the mother of a great many of the descendants. So that is, of course, the kind of the ultimate female desire is to have a lot of children in the Old Testament context, to have a lot of kids, because that's security for you in your old age, and that it means your life mattered. And both sides, having children means your life mattered. Being childless in the Old Testament context is kind of a sign that, in a sense, your life doesn't really matter. So, because you're not leaving anything beyond your years.
It's interesting to me that she was given the name of the child, the name to call her child, which is, rather unique. There's 2 or 3 or 4 different places in the Bible where God gives a name for a child to be born, to a person before it's born, and this is one. Their Hagar is a lonely servant or a slave or whatever. And she's given her son's name before he's born. It's interesting. It probably doesn't mean anything.
It means a great deal. I think it means a lot. This is a very surprising passage in a lot of levels, I think. And that's, I think the name means a lot, and the prophecy about him is very significant. Yes, sir.
She's told to submit Sarah when she returns. She had been kind of, I don't know, I would say a little bit arrogant about her position with having, having received a child and Sarah couldn't. And she was told to go back and submit to Sarah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. It's there was certainly resentment between the two. It's kind of postured more that Hagar just was despised. What does it say? Her mistress was despised in her sight in verse 4. So going back and forth, as we talked about last week a little bit, the whole interplay, how Sarai gives Hagar to Abram in our context is very horrible, really. It's we don't have a really contemporary situation where this could be forced on someone like this and everybody think it's okay or it's wonderful. But the response in that cultural context is probably wasn't seen quite that way, and Hagar's favor that is shown upon her by conceiving is a source perhaps of arrogance, like as you said, or certainly a cause of strife between the two women in Abram's life at this point. So Abram kind of checks out at this point. It's interesting to see this now. Abram is, in verse 6, it's your maid, you do whatever you want. You handle it. This was all kind of saying, this was all your idea to begin with, so you take care of it. I don't know how good a response that is on Abram's. It's how good a response is it when the head of the whole household just checks out of one of the big problems in the household, but that's how it was handled. And there's Sarah, and basically runs her off, treats her harshly, and then now she is an unwed mother, effectively out in the world, and maybe no apparent place to go for safety or security at that point. So, and that's where the angel of the Lord appears to her. So,
I would have been a little conflicted with that kind of a prophecy. I have a son, but learning about what type of man he was going to grow up to be, that'd be a little bit alarming.
that he's a wild donkey of a man.
Yeah, and everyone's hands against him, and his hands against everyone, all his brothers. That would be tough to learn at that point.
It's a violent time, a contentious time. I think it's kind of whatever a mother really expects. I know of a mother of a high school football player in Texas, and she is very assertive in her determination that Texas high school football will be played this year. No matter what. Her son's a big shot quarterback, and he's going to a Power 5 conference school, and he's going to have a great senior year and move up the rankings and get all his stars and all that stuff. So that's a Texas high school football mom, and they are a unique breed. If you ever get a chance to know one of them, They don't quite see the world the way the rest. Some of us might say, "I don't want my child getting hurt out there."
Well,
She's not afraid of him getting hurt. He's going to hurt somebody else. That's how it's
but
going.
your point goes to what Tammy's talking about. This mom is talking about how good he's going to be and how I'm going to make sure that he's good and everything's going to go great for him. And then here Tammy, the mother's learning, well, not only is he going to be called a wild donkey of a man, but everybody's going to hate him, and he's going to hate everybody. The Texas mom is more traditional about what, thinking good things about what your kid's going to do and happy for him and success and that kind of stuff. Whereas this is, I would imagine it'd be very disheartening to think about this prophecy for your child, and at this time it's her only child, and she hasn't even had him yet.
Could it mean that he was going to be a huge guy?
A huge?
Is it that big?
Compared to what?
Elephant?
I think it means he's just going to be a scrapper and a fighter, and he's going to live in a world and kind of moving into kind of the theological significance of just the prophecy, I guess you could say. And one of the ways it works is, we've talked about it a little bit, but Genesis, one of the things, once we move into the Abrahamic narrative, is the constant two paths going forward, the flesh and the promise. Or better, maybe understood as the flesh and faith. And we normally think of the flesh as being inherently sinful. And in this case, in this story, if there is sin, who is it on? Maybe a little bit on Hagar for being arrogant afterwards, I guess you could say. But whose faith failed in this story? Sarah's faith failed. And Abraham, you could say, is stepping outside the marital. We'll see next week or in chapter 17 what Abraham comes to think about Ishmael, and it's maybe a little bit surprising too. The name Ishmael means God has hearkened or God has heard. So, and this is, as Mark said, this is a name that doesn't come from Abram or from Hagar, but from God himself. God has declared this to be the name of the child. So God is saying in Ishmael, God has heard. And who has he heard? He has heard Hagar. He has heard this slave woman banished from her household, at odds with her mistress. God doesn't completely take her side and say, you were horribly wrong. You were perpetually a victim. You are weak, and there need to be reparations paid or anything like that. God is not quite that far, perhaps, but he is showing his concern for her. And he is saying to her, I have heard you. Your child is a means by which I have heard you. And that's, Hagar's response is, you are a God who has seen me. Hagar, and this is the most surprising point of the passage, I think, this runaway slave names God. He has other names too. This isn't the name Israel knew him by necessarily, but this is a remarkable moment. With all these big figures in history talked about, it's this slave woman pregnant out of wedlock naming God. God is the God of the oppressed. He truly is. He reaches out to people who are in distress. He moves through them and redeems through them in their weakness. He shows his power. In human weakness, God's strength is made perfect. This is how God can do things that we can't possibly imagine, and bring good and bring life out of things that we think are terrible and the things that are death. No matter how we think about the Hagar-Abram interaction and conception of this child, God has redeemed it. I mean, Ishmael is a blessing. He's a blessing to Abraham. He's a blessing to Hagar. He's a blessing to the world. He's going to be the father of nations. And he's going to be a handful. But aren't most great men, I mean, you look at it through history, whoever we consider to be great men, most of them were handfuls, weren't they? Most children with high potential are harder to raise. They don't fit in the shoehorn a nice little track along the way. They buck the system. They just don't fit in. They're bored with the average, experience. And that's Ishmael. He's just not going to fit in. And coming back to the dichotomy between the life of the flesh and the life of faith or life of the promise, it's not that the flesh is inherently bad, but it's what human beings can come up with. It's the best thing this is the best way Sarai and Abram could remedy their barrenness by their own means. This is emptying the bank account, going to the fertility doctor when you can't have kids. Borrowing against the house, getting money you don't have, you maxing out the credit card and everything to try to conceive. This is the best they can come up with. Going to a surrogate at a time before any other way of impregnating a surrogate would have been possible or thought of. This is the flesh. Ishmael is the flesh. And it's not all bad, is it? It's not. He's going to have contention between the brothers, but the brothers, the descendants of Abraham through Sarah, they have contention amongst themselves, don't they? They don't always get along as individual sons. What do they do to Joseph? As tribes, there's at least one major civil war in which the tribe of Benjamin is almost completely eliminated. So life is contentious. Life has got conflict in it. We cannot be conflict avoidant and be effective in serving God. We have to be conflict resolvent. We resolve conflict. We don't avoid it. Conflict is unavoidable. Even in marriages, it's unavoidable. You're going to have conflict. And we resolved it. I get the remote control. That's the reason how we resolve. See if Sherry says anything about that. But that's the nature of it. They're going to be fighting. He's going to have a great role in human history himself. And from the reader's perspective, the original readers, the Jewish people reading this, these are where our enemies, but also our frenemies. These are our descendants of some of our people, our neighbors who cause problems that we have fights with, but they're still relatives. And when you go to the family reunion and it's big and there's lots of cousins and everything, are you happy to see everyone there?
Sure.
Mark is. But they're not all happy to see him. That's the thing. That's kind of they're happy he brought Karen. No, that's the thing.
It's interesting that Hagar, being an Egyptian, was grown up in a country that had many gods, really. Egyptian had God of this and that and a few other things. And yet she was able to recognize the one true God when the angel spoke to her.
Well, I think you may be giving her a little too much credit there. I think she certainly realized the divine presence.
Yeah, okay.
And I think you're also maybe giving the early patriarchs and matriarchs a little too much credit. Israel struggled with polytheism for a very long time. And as you see the story of Jacob, Jacob is pretty ambivalent about God for much of his early years. Jacob, even when he really commits to God, it's because God's going to favor him. Because it's not this, I'm going to follow God because even if he makes me suffer, like Job, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. It's not that noble. Job is incredibly noble. That's the great story of Job. But Jacob isn't quite. Jacob is a very hard character to put your arms around and love. And we have to, I guess, at some point do it. I haven't always been there, but he's that relative that maybe you're a little bit embarrassed by at times. So I'm that relative in my family, so there's always one, isn't there? Yes, ma'am.
Have you noticed that in the first part of it, it talks about the angel of the Lord spoke to her and said all this stuff, and the angel of the Lord said to her, then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God who sees. And that, I think I read in your thing that she was the first one who named God or something like that. But is she naming God or is she naming the angel of the Lord?
Well, I think she's naming God, but you're right. The message originally is coming from an angel, is said to have come from the angel of the Lord. But she reveals that messenger, that angel, is bringing to her the assurance that the sender of the messenger is aware of her plight.
Yeah. But it normally when they use the word Lord, they're talking about God. And in 13, she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her.
Yes, you are
It's a little bit
God who
confusing.
sees. It is. Israel, they had their name, and this is kind of somehow when they date the different sections of the Old Testament is what they call God. That's one of the clearest indicators. After Moses, God reveals his name to Moses. God tells Moses, this is my name. I am Yahweh. That's the name. It's YHWH. And it was for centuries mistranslated as Jehovah. And I'm not saying we should never say Jehovah or whatever. That's what, it's the name I guess you could say others gave him. But they had such reverence for that name that they would never use it. One way to never take it in vain is to never use it. And so it was lost kind of for a long time, exactly how they would just have the consonants. They didn't have the vowels in there. When they wrote it down, they would just use the consonants. And the Jewish priests would know what it was, and it'd be passed down. But it wasn't written down anywhere. So we kind of...
This ties in with what Mark was saying about she was raised with a whole lot of gods.
Yes.
She said, you are a God. It didn't say you are God. See, so
You are a God who sees.
Her raising has caused her this ideas of not gelling quite as we see it now from looking back at it. We know that God is the only God, but she was raised having umpteen gods.
Well, I think, it's maybe a little presumptuous to think that Abram and his descendants thought of God totally monotheistically, that he was the only one true God. This has not really been, clearly the Israelites, when they come up out of Egyptian captivity, are still polytheistic. What's one of the first things they do when they get free? They build a golden calf and worship it. And it's the traditions that they have too. Monotheism is a concept that they struggle with for a really long time. You know, we see it a little bit more because we're reading the writings of the holy men of the people, you know, the prophets and the priests who wrote the text were closer to monotheism than probably the average people were. And that's why you read about, Sherry was reading, I think, in the book of Judges the other day, and read the story of Gideon and how Gideon, after he has had this great victory from God, still practices idolatry thereafter. And it's, you know, it's just something they struggled with. You know, and by the time Jesus is on the stage in the first century, the Jewish people are thoroughly monotheistic. Really, after they go into captivity and come back out, they have different struggles, but they're pretty convinced that there's only one God. It really sinks into them that there's only one God. That's their belief system. And yet it's the foundational statement of their faith, which Moses gives them, the Shema, there is only one God, and he's our God. So it is, she is polytheistic. I think that's a very accurate statement.
Sort of what I was bringing out, that she was confused, you know, and her raising had a lot to do with it.
Well, her background was polytheistic. She was polytheistic. To say Abram was absolutely monotheistic is favorable. May or may not be accurate, but it's favorable. I mean, he certainly has followed God. He certainly is doing what God has told him to do. Whether he thinks this is the only God in the universe,
I'd like to think so.
yeah, it's nice because we believe that now. It's very much, we're monotheistic, and yet we believe in Father, Son, and Spirit. So one God in three persons. That's pretty complicated to understand as well. So I think maybe the figures back then weren't quite so deterministic about it, you know, that this is how it is, and this is the only, that maybe they just hadn't gotten to that point yet. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. We'll just go ahead and read verses 15 and 16 and wrap it up. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. Good for Abraham, huh? Having kids when he's 86. It gets wilder than that, though, down the road, doesn't it? I want to talk a little bit about Paul's take on this in Galatians chapter 4, where he does something, again, really surprising. Paul is really good at taking things from the Old Testament and reworking them into the Christian theology, the Christian belief system. And it's one of those things, one of his techniques, that if you look back and you can say, well, that's not really what the Old Testament says, Paul. But Paul makes it what it says in a way. And it certainly makes it in a way where our faith does not stand completely in isolation from the rest of God's actions in the world. Just as Ishmael, you know, what happens with Ishmael is ultimately he is signed. God proves in Ishmael that he cares for people outside of the primary line of faith. The primary line of faith is Abram, Sarai, and their descendants. And yet he has a covenant, and he assures blessing toward Ishmael, who is outside. He is both a sign of God's love beyond the line of faith, but also a threat that sign, by God showing love to people outside of the family of faith, it somewhat threatens the family of faith in a way, at least in our perception and our feeling. I send the rain upon the just and the unjust. So when God blesses the unjust, I mean, wouldn't it be easier for us to convince the world that we were right about everything if we were all incredibly wealthy and every other person barely subsisted, barely eked their way through life? Couldn't we go to them and say, look, all you got to do is be a Christian and you can have a life of ease and comfort. Wonderful things will happen for you.
A lot of preachers making money doing that.
Yeah. But there are a lot of evil men and women out there that have a whole lot of money, aren't there? And we can't say God hasn't blessed them. All good gifts come from God. God sometimes uses them and redeems them. Redeems their actions to bring about a blessing, makes all things work together for the good of those who love him. So this flesh faith thing, the flesh can superimpose its will on God and sometimes for a short period of time improve the situation that was otherwise being experienced. Abram, Sarai, and Hagar resolved in a way the barrenness for a time. Now, ultimately, it's not satisfactory. It's not satisfactory to Sarai. It's not satisfactory to God. God doesn't say, okay, good enough. What's interesting in Galatians chapter 4 is that Paul looks back on this story, and instead of saying to the Jewish people, yes, you're all wonderful, you're all children of Sarah, you're all children of the wife, you're children of faith, you're children of promise. He is saying that because of clinging to your DNA, clinging to your biological origins, your physical ancestry, you are making yourself the children of the slave. You are relying upon the flesh, relying upon the works of the law, relying upon who your mom and daddy were and are, means you are claiming your relationship with God through flesh, through the slave. And it is Christians, regardless of their DNA, regardless of their nation of origin, regardless of their physical family of origin or biological background, regardless of all that, who have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, who are the children of faith, the children of the wife, the children of promise. Now, do you think the Jewish audience is going to be happy to hear that? Every now and then someone finds out, it's a surprise to them who their real daddy really is. Imagine how surprising it can be sometimes to find out who your real mama is. It wasn't so long ago in this country that a lot of people grew up thinking their big sister was, thinking that the person who they thought was their big sister turned out later on to be their mama, right? That used to be kind of how that situation was dealt with. And that the one they called mama was actually their grandmother. So it's not without precedent in human history to be surprised to find out who your real mama was. But Paul, a Jew himself, and he has all the pedigree that anyone could ever want of a Jewish person. He is of that rarest tribe of Benjamin. He's got all of the things you could want to be a good Jew. And he calls it rubbish. King James Version says dung. compared to being with God, in God, through the faith of Jesus Christ. To him, the promise is infinitely greater than the flesh, no matter how it looks in the short term. The flesh may be easier, the flesh may be quicker. The faith will pay off eternally. A relationship with God in faith has eternal reward. It doesn't make it more enjoyable. It doesn't make it easier. People who say, that people who believe in God are weak, it's because they can't deal with reality themselves. They have to have the crutch of God. I think believing in God, is about living in your weakness in a sense, not going out and fixing things yourselves according to your own way. It's much easier to do it yourself. It's much easier to make your way through your life doing what you think is best all the time. I think it's harder to live in faith. It's harder to live authentic Christianity than it is to live according to your own wisdom. There's a philosopher that once said, Christianity has not been tried and found wanting. Christianity has been tried and found difficult and rejected. It's too hard to be a Christian. That's why we don't want to be a Christian. And Abraham and Sarah, they're proof of what it means to live a life of faith. Sometimes we all fall and we try to fix things for ourselves. When we do, we won't like the result. Won't really satisfy. Ultimately, only God can fix things God's way. And when he does it, it's far greater. Now, it's not easier. It may not be, from a human perspective, preferable even. Isaac's descendants will be slaves. Ishmael's descendants, it's not said anywhere that they'll be slaves. Some of them probably were, but not on a national level. So, this is setting up this whole rivalry between flesh and faith, and ultimately, our only hope with God is through faith, isn't it? We're not, maybe somebody here has got Jewish blood in them that I don't know about, and that's fine if you do. But I don't have a drop. Mom and Dad did the DNA 23andMe, and there wasn't one bit of Jewish blood in them. So there's not a drop of it in me. There's more Norwegian than I thought, but those Vikings got around. So what are you going to say? Anyone else have any thoughts? I'll give you the last word before we turn it over to Mr. Hensley. Okay. Thank you for your comments.